The verse that we've been using as a springboard comes from Paul's writing, and that's what he says, helping us to know why the stories and the accounts in the Old Testament are preserved for us. And this is what he says. Everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through endurance and the encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope. When we're going through things that we would rather not go through, the stories in the Old Testament are stories of people whom God made promises to. They had to endure in difficulties before they were able to grasp the fulfillment of the promises. And so there was a time lapse between when God made the promises and when they were able to experience them. And these stories are intended to help us to understand that in our walk with Christ, He will ask us to continue to follow Him, even though the promises that He made, we can't put our hands on them. We have to continue to walk in the direction, and that's what the stories are intended for. Sometimes we can learn more from someone who fails than someone who succeeds. If we are able to follow in the path of someone who did not endure, who had the opportunity to hear things and to learn things, but in the final analysis, it wasn't enough to keep them on the path. What is it that can... Well, Jesus taught His disciples for 3 years. I can't imagine anyone having a better teacher. The fact that Judas Iscariot was Jesus-proof is startling. How in the world can that be? Somebody can have a relationship to see the miracles, to actually participate in them. He was one through whom some of these things occurred, and in the final analysis, it wasn't enough to keep him on the path. Let's investigate the scenes of his life and see if we can answer that question. Why was Judas Jesus-proof? That's what it says. Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped His feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of His disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray Him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He didn't say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Okay, we learn a couple things from Judas that aren't exactly virtuous. He was a thief. He would help himself to what was in the money. Jesus made collections. People would give him money so that they could get the supplies they needed to go from point A to point B. Judas was the banker, and he would embezzle some of the funds. He was a thief, and he was also a hypocrite. He claimed to be concerned about the poor so that money would be given, but he really didn't care about the poor. He would say, we should give this to the poor, but that really wasn't something that he felt or believed in. I think we could say then, Judas had a problem with money worship. In the Bible, money is put on a status with God. He says you can't serve God or money. It was money that ended up tipping the scales. And Judas might have had thoughts of, you know what, I don't like what Jesus is saying, I don't like where this is going. But it was money that finally tipped the scale and caused Judas to go from thinking about it to taking action. Look what it says. Judas Iscariot went to the chief priests and asked, what are you willing to give me if I can hand him over to you? So they counted out for him 30 silver coins. I guess they gave it to him in advance. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. And he was looking for an opportunity when Jesus would be somewhat secluded. He found that opportunity. Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd, armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests and elders of the people. They knew that Jesus was going to be isolated because Judas told them when Jesus would be alone. So they sent a large crowd, clubs, torches, an army. And now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. It would seem that Judas underestimated the danger that he was subjecting Jesus to. We don't really know what was on his mind. I mean, he sold Jesus out, but what was he thinking? We don't know. But when things happened really quickly, they condemned him, took him into custody. Judas wasn't expecting this. And what ends up happening, when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 silver coins to the chief priests and the elders. "I have sinned," he said, "for I have betrayed innocent blood." "What is that to us?" they replied. "That's your responsibility." So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. And then he went away and hanged himself. Money is like God in that it makes God-like promises. God says, "I will never leave you and I will never forsake you." If you have me, you have the source of provision and protection. Money makes the same claim. "I will never leave you and I will never forsake you." If you have enough money, you will be protected and provided for. And what we see, Judas, then whatever he thought of doing with these 30 silver coins, he understood, what good was this do to me? Now he's isolated from Jesus. He's isolated from the Pharisees. He is alone. Takes his money, throws it into the temple, and any promises that the money makes to be his source of provision and protection, now he sees how empty that promise is. He just knows that this can't do anything for me. Money, then, the love of money, constitutes a spiritual challenge? Is that why Judas was Jesus-proof? The Bible doesn't say that. It's hard for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. Not impossible. Matthew was a tax collector. He would have been wealthy as a tax collector. He would have been able to put a surcharge, and he had money. And so he became, Zacchaeus was a tax collector. It's not greed as an issue, but it seems like there's something else we've got to find. There's a root issue here. And we've talked about it before, but it seems there's three things we have to look at to try to figure out, why do we do the things we do? You know, there's actions, which is what we do. And so there's Judas betraying Jesus and taking the money and throwing. But then, in order to understand actions, you've got to understand attitudes. And that's something we know. Judas was greedy, but we don't know a lot about his attitude. But attitude's important. Would you agree? You know, what we do is because of our attitude. And so there's actions and attitudes, but at the base of attitudes, there are thoughts. The way we think about a person. The way Judas thought about Jesus. He must have believed and was devoted to Jesus at one point. You know what the problem was, it seems? Judas was plugged into two different sets of people that had two really different religious views. There was Jesus and the other disciples, and then there were the Pharisees. And Judas was pulled in half by these two forces more than I think other people were. We've looked at this before, but it is telling. This is a map of Israel. Israel was divided into two parts. They called them two houses. There's the house of Israel to the north and the house of Judah to the south. Both parts of Israel went into captivity. The north went into captivity to the Assyrians, and the way the Assyrians dealt with people, they forced them to intermarry. So what ended up happening over the centuries, the unique culture of Israel got kind of distilled. They intermarried a bunch of people, so somebody who's Jewish married a Gentile, and so then their kids weren't as religiously devoted, and that happened over the centuries. So in the north, they weren't as devoted. The southern part of Israel went into captivity, but the Babylonians were different. They allowed countries to have their culture. So they allowed Jews to have their culture. So what ended up happening then is that it created two very different kinds of obligations. And as we see, pretty obvious, that all of the disciples, except one, came from the north. Judas came from the south. I've told you before, but there were stories of Pharisees were always answering questions about, hey, what can I do on the Sabbath? I mean, can I do this? Can I do that? We've talked before that the Jews at that time were obsessively, compulsively devoted to law. And there were really picky things. So you could wear a tie going from the second floor of the house to the first floor. You could wear it, but you couldn't carry it because that's work. And there was all these kind of things that were kind of maddening. And Pharisees were always getting questions like this, especially in the south. There was a Pharisee who went to the north. And he relocated to the north and lived in the northern part of Israel, the house of Israel, where they had intermarried. They wouldn't care much about the law. And in 18 years, this Pharisee got 2 questions about what to do and not to do on the Sabbath. He just didn't care as much. It just wasn't as important. All of the disciples, except one, came from the north. They had been pulled from the influence of the Pharisees, the influence of the law. They had distanced themselves from it over the centuries, or been distanced from it. And Judas wasn't in the same place. So you know what ended up happening? The opinion of family and Pharisee really, really mattered to Judas, because it mattered to the culture he was part of, more than it mattered to the culture of those from the northern part. The bonds of faith and family were very strong, too strong to allow Judas to follow Jesus wholeheartedly. So here's Judas. He's pulled by family and Pharisee, and he's pulled by Jesus and the disciples and his friendship with them. And he is more than the others pulled apart, because he is a Judean from the south, and he's also a disciple of Jesus. Paul dealt with the same issue. When Paul was a Pharisee, he would have lived at the time that Jesus lived. And he knew about him, and he probably saw the miracles, and Paul was no dummy. But the influence of the culture of the South would not allow Paul to believe until Jesus had to appear to him, strike him blind, knock him off his donkey, and then he was able to believe. It was hard. Very, 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 very difficult to believe if you were still rooted in Old Covenant devotion. And that's the thing Judas was. Paul ends up identifying this, and here's what he said. We've looked at this verse. He writes it to people living in Corinth. And these people in Corinth, like Judas, are being pulled apart by individuals like Paul and his leaders, pulling them to help people understand you're under the new covenant now. You're under the new covenant now. You're under the new covenant now. And there's people pulling them that way, but then there's these other people pulling them in a different direction. Okay, Jesus might love you if you obey him, but you're still, God will like you more if you keep the law, and especially if you stop buying things from unbelievers. And if you stop hanging around with unbelievers. And boy, you better not marry an unbeliever. And that's what the church in Corinth is facing. Here's what Paul writes. Do not be yoked together with unbelievers. For what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? What fellowship can light have with darkness? What harmony is there between Christ and Belial? What does a believer have in common with an unbeliever? What agreement is there between the temple of God and idols? You know what's happening? These individuals that are coming into the church in Corinth are using these questions to get people to stop interacting with people from the world. And what they would say, let's say that you are the people who, you don't do business with the world because the world's evil, but you guys do. And what these individuals who are coming into this church would say to you, okay, do not be yoked together with unbelievers. So you know what? You know where you should and shouldn't buy things from. Because what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? So why are you doing business with wicked people? What fellowship can light have with darkness? You claim to be the light over there and you spend time with people who are in the dark. That's what the argument would have been. And Paul writes this letter, and he uses the same condemnations, but he directs them not against the people, but against these teachers who are pulling the people back under law. He ends up saying, what agreement is there between the temple of God and idols? For we are the temple of God, as God has said, I will live with them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. Again, they would teach that if you are really a mature, devoted Christian, you will only listen to Christian radio. You will only frequent Christian establishments. And that's the more separated you were from the world, the more devoted you were. That's what they were being told. But this isn't what Paul means when he says, don't be yoked together with unbelievers, because, well, look what he says. In the letter he wrote a year before, he said, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. And he told them that. Don't associate with sexually immoral people. And what people said, well, okay, so if we can't associate with sexually immoral people, I can't walk around downtown because I don't know who sleeps with who. And Paul explains to them, wait a minute. Not at all meaning the sexually immoral of this world, or the greedy, and swindlers, or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. Paul says, wait, and Paul was very different. They would be arguing with these Christians, telling them to pull away from the world, and Paul says, don't do it. I didn't mean to separate from the world, because if you don't associate with the sexually immoral, or idolaters, or swindlers, or greedy of the world, that's what the world is characterized by, and don't separate yourself from them. For what partnership has righteousness and lawlessness? He's warning them against the people who are pulling them in different directions. I think I've mentioned this before briefly in terms of the history. A couple hundred years before Jesus came, and it was 200 years after the captivities, 200 to 300, what ended up happening is Greece, the Greek kingdom, ended up conquering the Persian kingdom. So they were in charge. And during this time, Jews in Israel really liked Greek culture, and they were adopting more of it. There were Jews who were very concerned that the church in Israel, Jews, were becoming too worldly. And so there came to be a group of people who were rebellious but really devout, and they were called the Hasidim. The Hasidim was a group of individuals who said, we need to get serious about following the law of God. Because if we follow the law of God, He's going to bless us. If we don't follow it, He's going to curse us. Therefore, they held people's feet to the fire and said, we really need to be serious about the law. And they were successful. In fact, what ended up happening, they fostered a revolt. And the Jews, this little kingdom, fought off the Greek kingdom and retained their independence. They got independent from Greece for a while. Hanukkah is the feast. It happens around our Christmas time where you light the candles if you're a Jew. What that signifies is the event where, because of the Hasidim, the Jews pushed off Greek influence, and they were able to go into the temple and light the candles like they were supposed to be lit and honor God like they were supposed to honor Him. That ended up happening. Once the revolt happened, then the Hasidim split into two parts, the Pharisees and the Essenes. The Pharisees said, okay, listen, the temple in Jerusalem is really corrupt. It really is. It's worldly, but you can honor God in your home, you can go to the synagogues, and you'll be okay. That's what the Pharisees believe. The Essenes says you can't, it's too far gone. You have to pull out and live in communes and form your own independent society. And that's what they believed. And the Essenes then, they broke off. John the Baptist was an Essene. They were the ones that used the word Belial to talk about Satan. So what's happening here is that these individuals who are Jews, who teach you need to be separate, they're the ones that are pulling on these people. So Paul is pulling them back under the new covenant, and these other ones are pulling them back under the old, and that's what Paul is confronting. So here's what he says. Therefore, come out from them and be separate, says the Lord. Touch no unclean thing, and I will receive you. I will be a father to you, and you will be my sons and daughters, says the Lord Almighty. Since we have these promises, dear friends, let us purify ourselves from everything that contaminates body and spirit, perfecting holiness out of reverence for God. Well, Paul is encouraging, and this is the point, that if you're pulled between Old Covenant and New, understand what Jesus is desiring is that you come out from under the Old Covenant and under the New. We're going to celebrate communion in just a couple minutes. And that's what communion's all about. It says, this is the new covenant in my blood. Jesus came to pull us out from under the old covenant and under the new. And that's what Paul is asking them to do. He says, don't just look out for those things that contaminate body. Look out for the things that contaminate spirit. What are the things that contaminate spirit? At the time, there were all kinds of things that contaminated body. You could eat the wrong things, and they would have been very aware of that because there was a lot of things you had to avoid under the Old Covenant. What is it that contaminates spirit? The spirit is the inner part of us where we conceive of God, where we think about God, where our our thoughts about God are. That's what spirit is like. There's some things that contaminate that place in our minds where we think about God. Paul writes, you did not receive a spirit that makes you a slave again to fear, but you have received a spirit of sonship. How can you tell a contaminating spirit? How can you tell when you're being pulled by someone in a direction that is going to contaminate the thoughts that Jesus wants you to have? One way is if there's a lot of fear. You have not received a spirit of slavery again, leading to fear. A spirit of slavery is fear-based. It says, you better obey or else. And that's not the spirit that Jesus is commanding us to have. And it's what he says, God has made us sufficient as ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter but of the Spirit, for the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And this is what's happening. Judas is being pulled. How do we deal with spiritual resistance? All of us, we deal with stuff. We deal with areas of behavior that are problematic. In fact, you might hear in some places areas of disobedience. You might hear about them as strongholds. You ever hear about that? That you have a stronghold of anger, or you have a stronghold of greed, or you have a stronghold of this or that. And the way it's described is that a stronghold is an area of besetting sin that you just can't get yourself out of. And Paul talks about strongholds and the fact that we need to pull them down. But when Paul talks about strongholds, he's not talking about behavior. So Paul wouldn't say your stronghold is the stronghold of lust. That's not the stronghold. The stronghold of anger. I'm not saying you might deal with that. You might deal with anger, but that's not the stronghold that needs to be demolished. It's not a behavior with Paul. You know what it is? What it is for Paul? Strongholds are the beliefs. They're the beliefs. And, well, look what he says. We saw this last week. And the weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. Okay, there are strongholds, and they need to be demolished. But what are these strongholds? And look what he says. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. Here's what a stronghold is. When somebody gets up and says, this is what God is like, and they are viewing God from an old covenant perspective, that's veiled. It's not clear because the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, does not give us a clear image of God. It's veiled, it's contaminated, it's not the truth. Jesus came to reveal God. And that's how we need to tune God in. So what we need to be careful of? Strongholds. You know what strongholds are? Somebody who argues and pulls you into you better obey or else. That's the stronghold. You know what the stronghold is? That you need to be afraid of God. Because you know how God treats people that disobey Him. Don't you? You better go clean up your act. How do you deal with something like that? You know what Paul would say? You come out from that kind of influence, get out and be separate. That's what he's saying. Separate yourself from individuals who use fear to get you to comply, because that's not where Jesus is pulling you. That's what Paul is saying. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. We take every thought captive. I've talked about this before. When it talks about taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ, what some people think that you better only listen to Christian radio. You better only tune in Christian music and Christian programs, because that's what it means to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ, isn't it? No, it isn't. Taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ is to become discerning, because taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ is taking it captive to the new covenant. Under the new covenant, do you need to be afraid of God? No. So, when you identify thoughts in your mind that say, I better do this or else, you know what you do with that thought? What do you do with that thought? You're under arrest. You take it. Take that thought. And again, you might not be able to remove it from your head, but you identify, oh, wait, no. That thought that's in my mind, that's not Jesus' thought. That I need to make sure that every thought I have is Christian, because then God will, no. Think Christian thoughts? Absolutely, but Christian thoughts are new covenant thoughts. Jesus speaks for God. So, a couple things, and we're going to do communion. Correct your own vision. You might feel pulled. All of us, I think, feel pulled. If it's pulling you into fear, it's not him. It's not him. Get away from the group. Identify the thought. If it's pulled towards Christ, he says, I will be Helios. I will forgive your unrighteousnesses and remember your sins no more. What in the new covenant, you can't distance yourself from God. You can't. You can't. And when this belief ends up becoming more settled in your mind, it will give way to attitudes where you'll want to serve him, which will give way to actions. But it begins with thoughts, attitudes, and actions. Here's what Jesus said. This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do you know why we do communion monthly? You know why Jesus told us to remember it? I guess we need to be reminded that we're under a new covenant. And that the major thing that we are to demolish is places in our mind where we still think that God, now all of us deal with this, but as best we can, we do the hard work of understanding what the new covenant is, and as we become aware of thoughts and attitudes that are not in line with it, we learn to check them and to correct them. But Jesus saw, he says, this is the new covenant in my blood. We're going to do what the church has been doing for centuries, but not always understanding. We're going to grab the juice and the bread, and we're going to think of the covenant that he's made with us, and then we'll eat and drink. And you know why we're going to eat and drink? Because we're celebrating being under a new covenant. That's something to celebrate, isn't it? Let's do that. Father, as we take this cup in our hands and the bread, we think of strongholds, which are ways of understanding you that are no longer relevant. You don't relate to us from Mount Sinai. You relate to us from Mount Calvary. You would have us understand that, take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ, that our thoughts would be new covenant thoughts. And again, for all of us, we're going to be stuck somewhere in between, because we have a lot of thoughts in our mind deeply rooted, and that those roots don't come up easily. We don't need to be perfect. I pray little by little, as we make room for the new covenant, little by little the new covenant pulls us out of the old. And that's the way it works. We can't get out of the old, but if we embrace the new covenant, it will suck us out of the old. That's the way it works. So we take the juice and we take the bread. We thank you for the covenant that we get to think about again. That you're in us, you're with us, good is ahead of us, guaranteed. If we do something wrong, if we become greedy or whatever it is, you say that you're still in us. You're still with us. Good is still ahead of us, guaranteed, because under the new covenant, we can't be distanced from you. Thanks for that. Thank you for the new covenant. And as we eat and drink, we celebrate it. Eat and drink. Let's stand for closing prayer. Again, we thanks God for remembrances like this. We've done what you want us to do. It tells us to gather, celebrate the new covenant. And we have ways to go, but thanks that we have the ability to think about it. And little by little, our thinking be conformed to it. Thanks in Jesus' name. Amen.